Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We are delighted that you're able to join us today for the fourth webinar in our special ABEP webinar series titled Ethics and Professional Boundaries in Mental Health Practice. I want to take a second to acknowledge ABEP and thank them for the great work we've accomplished together since our partnership began in December 2021. The Trust and ABEP are similar in many ways, especially when it comes to supporting psychologists and the profession of psychology. I look forward to continuing this mutually beneficial relationship by creating informative content like this webinar. I'm really excited about today's webinar. It's being presented by a dear friend of mine, Dr. Jerry Kucher. He is the founding editor of the journal Ethics and Behavior, and previously served as editor of the Journal of Pediatric Psychology and The Clinical Psychologist. Dr. Kucher has published more than 350 articles and book chapters, and has authored or edited 17 books, including Ethics in Psychology and the Mental Health Professions, The Psychologist's Desk Reference, and The Parent's Guide to Psychological First Aid. Dr. Kucher earned 5 specialty diplomas from the American Board of Professional Psychology, Clinical Child Adolescent, Family, Forensic, and Health Psychology, and holds active psychology licenses in Illinois, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and New Hampshire. He has served in many state and national professional leadership roles, including as APA president in 2006, and Dr. Kucher served as a member and chair of the Trust Board. Between 2010 and 2013, he was vice chair, and he was chair between 2014 and 2017. In the interest of time, I've placed the rest of his bio on a slide for you. So I know everyone is going to learn a lot in these next 2 hours, and I promise they'll fly by because Dr. Kucher is so knowledgeable. Take notes, and as I said, we will try to answer as many questions as we can. So Dr. Kucher, thank you again for being with us today, and we all look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I'm going to be sharing my screen now. A lot of people feel anxious about attending ethics workshops. Usually they're afraid that they're going to discover that they're at some horrible risk or doing something terribly wrong in their practices. That is not this talk. I can tell you some things that you'd better not do, like punching out a colleague, committing insurance fraud, or lying to the FBI about where you got those top secret documents. But this talk is all about context, thinking through boundaries and thinking about how boundaries relate to our work amid widely varying contexts. I'm going to be asking your opinion about many cases as we go through this workshop, and that's going to be very important because there are differences of opinion in how to interpret ethical principles, especially when we're talking about boundaries. We all have different preferences about how we share things with clients or what we choose not to share. And that's going to be a part of the discussion. All of the polling opportunities that you have will be anonymous, but you'll be able to see how other colleagues think about the same issues. I want to let you know that I don't think I have any conflicts of interest with anything I'm going to talk about today. I do want you to also know that I'm presenting my own opinions. So the opinions I give you today are not those of any organizations that I'm affiliated with or work for. And yes, I do earn royalties selling books, but I'm not trying to sell them to you today. So first question, learning objectives. What is the goal of our session today? Well, first thing is I want you to be able to think about multiple roles and be able to analyze them and parse them, considering both historical and cultural contexts as we go along. I want you to be able to think through our current ethical standards and professional guidelines as they apply to some relatively complex case situations. I want you to be able to think and plan your own strategies, because we're going to talk about questions that clients will ask you and situations that you will encounter if you haven't already. And we want you to think through, how can I do this in the way that's in the best interest of my patients? Finally, I'm going to encourage you to apply the material that we talk about so that you can optimize the ethical functioning of your practice in a world where we're increasingly having no control over boundaries. Many of the issues we discussed today, there are legitimate differences of opinion, and we have to remain mindful of these differences, and some of these differences can have significant consequences. So, again, if you haven't already, you can join Poll Everywhere, and the password is Leo Caraballo 831. And that will appear at the top of every poll slide so that you can participate. So here's the poll for today, and I'm going to clear the responses so you can check now what is the weather in your neighborhood. And you'll see real-time polling. This is really great. You can see the percentages building up, including the 6% of you who are stuck indoors and you don't know why, because you don't know the weather because you're busy taking the poll. This is an illustration of what you're going to see with the QR code in the upper corner and the ability to log on. So when I pose questions to you, you will actually be able to weigh in and see how your colleagues are doing. I'm glad that at least 52% of you know that you have a sunny day ahead. So why do we even care about boundaries? Well, these boundary guidelines and ethical codes give us guidance about how we can manage our professional relationships. They also help us understand legal or professional boundaries. They help us to maintain a respectful, ethical, productive relationship and stay out of trouble. They also reflect all aspects of our relationships with patients, ranging from scheduling to fees to communications outside the office to self-disclosures, and talk about and give us guidance and ways to think about those. But what do we have to remember is that boundaries should neither be excessively rigid nor highly permeable. We want boundaries that we can consider in a meaningful way and adjust to the context. So since nothing is written in stone, how about some of the things that could go wrong if the boundaries are too blurred? A lot of people would argue that blurred boundaries are a slippery slope that leads to increasingly bad behavior. Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll talk about that in a minute. Some people talk about power manipulation and exploitation of people by their psychotherapist. How frequently does this happen? Too much familiarity can lead to transference and bias problems in therapy. Strong boundaries form a critical risk management strategy. But as you know, risk management isn't the same as ethics. Yes, we don't want to get in trouble, but we also want to provide optimal care for our patients. So for all of these criteria, I'm saying, well, maybe. So let's consider some boundaries being more formal than others. Differentiate in your mind boundary crossings versus boundary violations. We will often cross boundaries incidentally, or we may cross boundaries intentionally. We may share information about ourselves in an intentional way in the interest of enhancing the therapeutic alliance. We may avoid things for the same reasons. Those may be boundary crossings, but they don't really become boundary violations until we start taking advantage of a patient or in some way abusing the professional relationships. Some boundaries are trivial, some are ambiguous, some can be risky and harmful. Who decides? Well, there's a pretty clear boundary right there, but how meaningful is it? This could be an important boundary, but then standing with one foot in Iowa and the other in Nebraska is probably inconsequential as a boundary problem. So here's a question for you. Is it ever ethically appropriate to have sexual intimacies with a client? What do you think? Let's weigh in on that. Wow. Look at that. Well, that tells us something. 100%. I predicted that response. Congratulations. All of you have recognized sexual intimacies with patients are a significant boundary breach. Nearly every professional mental health code, social work, psychiatry, licensed professional counselors, psychologists, all agree with that's not a good idea with current psychotherapy patients. APA's current code proscribes it for a 2-year interval. In other words, sexual intimacies with a psychotherapy client within 2 years is an automatic no, probably a cause for expulsion. But wait, this avoids what my colleague Patricia Keith Spiegel coined in the late 70s, the "you're cured, let's screw" syndrome. When Tricia and I served on the APA ethics committee back in the 70s, we actually encountered people who would terminate therapy on a Friday afternoon and be in bed with the client on Friday night. That is obviously a no-no, but even after 2 years, even if you are in psychology as opposed to social work and psychiatry that say no, never sexual intimacies with former patients, even if you decide after 2 years somehow that you and one of your former patients want to get together in a sexual way, the ethics code points out that if the patient complains about being exploited, this comes back to bite you. What will the pending ethics code revision say? Many of you may know that the APA's code of conduct is about to come out with a proposed revision. I'm told that that will either be out by the end of 2023 or early in 2024. Then it will be out for public comment. I'm guessing that there will be no change in this particular issue, but still not a good idea. But wait, what counts as psychotherapy anyway? If you're running coaching, if you're running a wellness program, suppose you're running a 5-session smoking cessation program or a 10-session weight reduction program, is that therapy? Could I have a relationship with a client that I worked on one of these issues with? How about parental guidance? What if I'm helping a parent, I'm doing parental guidance for problems, behavioral problems they're having with their kid on a limited basis? Does that count as psychotherapy for a prohibition if the parent and I get smitten with each other? How about psychological assessment? Can I have a sexual relationship with someone I did an assessment on? We'll talk more about that later. The key here is considering the nature, duration, and intensity of the services you provide, as well as the patient's history and their mental health status, and also considering the likelihood of an adverse impact. And I've given you a link to a wonderful article here, Mike Gottlieb's decision-making model, thinking through some of these variables. And by the way, I'm going to call out a number of different articles and sources as I go through. All of them will be listed in the reference section at the end of the slides. So now everything else, everything non-sexual. And as Larry Archie is telling you, just because you did it doesn't mean you're guilty. And then the rest of this talk is going to be focused on the real meat of the problems that everyone doesn't agree on, the NSMR, non-sexual multiple role boundary issues. And these are the biggies. There was a period of time when boundary problems, including sexual ones, were the biggest reason for a licensing board complaint. Now they're the second biggest reason. The biggest reason is people who lie about completing their mandatory CE requirements get audited and get found out. So just keep that in mind. Don't lie to your licensing board about doing CE, but here you are picking up a couple of hours today. So all good, right? Here's the next slide for you. What is the most important reason to maintain strong professional boundaries? And I believe on this slide, I let you endorse more than one. So let's see what you think are the most important reasons to maintain strong professional boundaries. Very interesting. I can see there's about a third of you are slippery slope warriors. More than half of you don't want to exploit vulnerable patients. And we've got some of you that are noticing bias and risk management issues. Great response to the polling. Now I'm going to throw some cases at you. I'm going to give you a series of 3 cases, and I'm going to ask you to weigh in on the ethicality of the case, and then I'm going to get into a discussion on it with you. So here's case number 1, a family-based cure for same-sex attraction. A male cisgendered therapist learns that his 23-year-old daughter has experienced some same-gender attraction. He believes strongly that these inclinations in women are pathological and caused by some problem in the father-daughter relationship. So he begins intensive psychotherapy with his daughter as a patient to cure her of lesbianism. How certain are you that this behavior involves an unethical boundary crossing? Go ahead and weigh in. And I see we're pulsating between a few percentages of not at all certain, or maybe some probablys, some definitelys, some people thinking the license has to go. Fascinating. Okay, case number 2, intimate friendships with a patient's parent. A female therapist develops an intimate relationship with the mother of a child she's treating for a psychosomatic skin condition. She continues the relationship with the mother and also continues simultaneously treating 3 of the woman's children. So what do you think? Oh, that definitely zoomed up there very quickly. Let's see where we're going here as people weigh in. Okay, we see some definitely ones. Fewer are ready to jump in and revoke the license than they were on that last one. And there are a couple of small percentages of people that say, well, not at all, but maybe, I'm not sure. Okay, now case number 3. A psychotherapist enables an extramarital affair. A married cisgendered male therapist became smitten with the wife of another man. He feels guilty about it, about these lustful feelings, so he goes to see a respected psychiatrist and consults with that psychiatrist. The psychiatrist agrees to see the woman for a consultation, and the psychiatrist consultant convinces the woman to begin a sexual relationship with the married therapist. So now I'm going to ask you to rate the ethicality of the psychiatrist who agrees to see the woman who's being sought after and talk her into having an affair with the therapist. We're bouncing around here, but wow, this the definitelys, and even a bigger percentage wants that psychiatrist to lose their license for doing this. Okay, and now, as Paul Harvey, the famous radio commentator, used to say, and now the rest of the story. Case number 1 describes the circumstances under which Sigmund Freud began psychotherapy of his daughter, Anna, in 1911. Anna told her dad about some same-sex attraction, and he immediately took her into analysis 6 nights a week. Case number 2 describes Anna's 54-year relationship with Dorothy Burlingham, including treating 3 of Dorothy's children. And finally, case number 3 describes how Carl Jung fostered the start of a sexual relationship between Henry Murray and Christiana Morgan, the co-developers of the TAT, and it's told by Murray himself in his biography published in 1992. And boy, there's a lot more about Henry Murray that's interesting there, but I'm not going to describe it. The moment with Carl Jung is fascinating. When Murray went to Jung and told him that he was smitten with Christiana Morgan, Jung not only said, "Send her to me for a consult," but then invited Henry Murray to have dinner with him and his wife and his mistress, who was also his patient. So here we have the progenitors of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy, who back in the early start of the 20th century and into the 1930s had much more fluid ideas about boundaries than we would observe today. Just how slippery are those slopes? What is the evidentiary basis of having slippery slopes as a way to avoid an ethical catastrophe? First of all, the concept of a slippery slope refers, for people who might be unfamiliar with it, that it's once you engage in boundary slippage, it's easier to justify engaging in increasingly unethical behavior. And this suggests that unethical actions can lead to an erosion of ethical standards, and one slip down the slope and you're doomed to ethical hell. Well, maybe, but the problem here is that that logic follows what those of us that had to do Latin in high school would know as the non causa pro causa situation, where not the cause is substituted for the cause. And this gets to be very confusing. So imagine that something we'll call A happens. Then by a gradual series of small steps, you assume that because A happened, B, C, D, E, F through Z will also happen. And Z should never happen. So because if you do A, these other things will eventually happen, and Z is not good, you should never do A. Well, that might be true, but for this guy, it all depends on whether or not the wood chipper is turned on. Again, the idea behind one slip causing a total deterioration is really not well founded. And the concept that a domino effect will follow, and there'll be an increasingly exponential slide toward unethical behavior, is really not supported in the literature. Yes, there are anecdotes. Yes, you will run into cases where exactly this sort of thing happens, and it's an unfortunate situation. But how do we know the incidence of it? They are probably not common. And why do I say they're probably not common? Only about 2% of psychologists get investigated by licensing boards in any given year. The odds that you, as an individual practitioner, will get investigated is about 2 out of 10,000, putting aside the fact of those CE violations, assuming you don't lie about having done your CE. So the fact that you may get pulled in front of a licensing board, which absolutely will happen if there's a sexual intimacy complaint or a bad boundary violation complaint, is in reality quite low. And I've got to think that there are lots of opportunities where a practitioner slips on a boundary, but clearly the downhill slide is not inevitable. Now, we do understand that the incidence of getting called before a licensing board that I'm reporting to you is probably not a true incidence of misconduct. And we have Mike Gottlieb and Jeff Youngren and Tom Gutile and Glenn Gabbard on the psychiatry side that have published on this point. Not all incidents are reported. I know of 2 APA presidents, for example, who I will not name, who married former patients or former students. ethical acculturation is the course of action that I would prefer to recommend to you. The idea of shifting from risk management ethics, where I want to prevent terrible things from happening, to thinking about positive aspirational ethics, where we observe and teach ethics from the perspective of shifting our emphasis from misconduct to thinking of a more balanced, integrative approach of how we aspire to the highest ideals and get our students to think in ways where they are looking out for the patient's best interest. And the classic question, which I ask myself whenever I consider a boundary crossing, whether it's a self-disclosure or doing something for a patient or going somewhere with a patient or making some kind of new offering to a patient, is how will my doing X, whatever it is, benefit the patient? If I do not have a clear answer of how my doing something is likely to benefit the patient, I'm personally not going to take a chance. Yes, everything happens for a reason, and sometimes that reason is you're stupid and make bad choices. I try to avoid that. So tell me about your ability to maintain objectivity with patients. Never a problem, becomes a challenge with a few patients, becomes a challenge often, is always challenging. I have to stay mindful of it constantly. And we can see here that everyone, for the most part, I'm only seeing 4 or 5% saying it's never a problem. Most people are saying it can come up with a few patients. And there's some people who are saying it looks like about 20% that it's either a frequent challenge or it's a challenge that you need to remain mindful of. Now, a lot of this can depend on the nature of patients you're working with, and I'm going to give an example from my own practice shortly, but these are important things to think about. And what I want you to take away from this graph is the range of responses of your colleagues. I want to talk a little bit about the myth of objectivity. At times, we can demonstrate a degree of favoritism or a lack of favoritism. None of us exist free of biases. So the idea that we are therapists is totally unbiased coming into work with a patient is a myth. Some of us have clouded lenses, and these can come from subjectivity and perception, where we have inherent biases due to our beliefs, experiences, and so forth. It can also be emotional connections, relationships based on strong affect. All of these issues can come into play and cloud our lenses with respect to the ability to follow through as objectively as we might like to with patients. And by the way, I don't want to say that a lack of objectivity is a bad thing. There may be some patients, when we're listening to Carl Rogers, channeling the voice of Carl Rogers now, who said that if you have accurate empathy for the patient, and if you can take the patient's frame of reference and do a few other things, give them unconditional positive regard, you will make a big difference. So Rogers was not arguing for bias necessarily, but he was arguing for stepping into situations that might predispose you to emotional connections and get you into a degree of subjectivity. We all have unconscious biases in decision-making. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in part for his writings on heuristic biases. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, remember we have 5 senses. We are constantly being bombarded with data from all of our senses, but we have learned to channel those data, and we organize them in different ways in our mind, and we do sense making about it. The same thing happens in clinical situations. If you're an experienced psychotherapist, experienced psychodiagnostic assessor, you have shorthand in your mind for things that you're going to pay special attention to when you're looking for symptoms, when you're doing an intake, when you're thinking about next steps in the therapeutic processes. Sometimes these heuristics, these shorthand ways of doing things, let us act more quickly and efficiently, but sometimes they lead us astray. Two examples. One is confirmation bias, where we look for information that confirms our existing belief. I'm sure I'm right, but I just need to find the proof. Or the availability bias. The information is right in front of us. We have this data. So the data I'm looking at, show me this. We don't look for data that we're not looking at. When I'm doing a psychological assessment, for example, I'm looking at the data as they come in and I'm forming hypotheses about the patient, but I'm also saying to myself, are there any data which disconfirm the hypothesis? Do I have a complete set of data? The same thing is true of when you're working with a patient in therapy, especially a new patient who you're getting to know, and you have to begin to think, what am I not thinking about? Is there more that I need to be looking for? And these are just two of the common heuristic biases that human beings have. And there's lots of writing and reading that you can turn to. And Daniel Kahneman, again, is one of the best sources. And the follow through on this is, if I had a hammer, would all my patients look like nails? I've heard people tell me, I'm a trauma therapist and all my patients have trauma in their histories. How amazing. Is there anyone that hasn't had a traumatic experience in their life ever? That patient reminds me of the one who, okay, but are they the same as that one? My 3 patients typify the universe. And based on these 3 patients, I know how the 4th one is going to look. Most therapists pretty much agree that, stick in whatever you want. If things didn't go well, they probably didn't follow my advice. Again, these are common mental heuristics, traps that are easy to fall into. Just like this one here, eat lots of carrots. Is there some bias there? There are also communication and interpretation biases, and that can involve both what I'm trying to communicate and what I'm hearing. Even if someone is trying very hard to be objective, and especially in interpreting what someone else is saying, misinterpretation or subjective filtering can still occur. And language is often very imprecise, nonverbal cues open to interpretation. My favorite example of this kind of problem is the phrase, yeah, right. Someone is telling you about a great movie they saw, which you also say, and you say, yeah, right, that was great. Or someone is telling you about a movie that they liked, but you didn't like, or sarcastically respond to them, yeah, right. So your intonation can be very different depending on the text. Imagine what happens if you're communicating by telemetry, or if you can't see the person, you can't read their body language, or if they're from a culture where there's a different understanding. Classic examples include people from cultures where direct eye contact seems an aggressive act. And yet in Western society, doing a mental status exam, we often report on eye contact. You can imagine the yeah, right example that I just gave you, where my intonation makes a difference. What would it mean for a person whose native language was not English, who hadn't mastered intonations in English? So again, communication and interpretation biases are something that's there and we need to be aware of. How about if someone asks you, want some boneless chicken? Okay, there's your boneless chicken. Different meanings. Then we also have self-serving biases. And at times, people, including psychotherapists, are unskilled and unaware of their lack of skill. Many people don't acknowledge their biases with regard to information gathering, hypothesis testing, judgment, concepts of uncertainty, the risks they're willing to take. And people often overestimate their competencies or unaware of their own deficits, the Kruger-Dunning effect. And if you haven't read the Kruger and Dunning article, I really steer you toward it. It's wonderful and eye-opening. Wisdom has been chasing you, but you have always been faster, Grogu tells us. Still, we have to recognize that there are problems and that we're not omniscient and perfect. So who's going to pose the greatest boundary hazard? I would actually say there are three categories of practitioners we need to think about. There is a group, very small number of people in all professions who have no respect for boundaries. They're going to do what they want and exploit other people. And those are very dangerous people who shouldn't be practicing. But the largest body of practitioners, in my experience, having served on ethics committees and licensing boards, is that even bad boundary violations can often be circumstantial and driven by other factors. There are people who are serial violators, and there are people who find themselves in a circumstance where they make a bad choice. There are things we need to remain mindful about. I'm going to talk about dual or multiple relationships. Some relationships with patients outside of the therapy context are unavoidable, small world phenomena. I, as a pediatric psychologist, might have treated the kid who bags my groceries at the supermarket. You might find yourself treating someone that you have another interaction with in the world. But these can lead to problematic boundary violations if not thought about and if not managed properly, especially if you live in a small town or an area where you're likely to bump into people both in your office and outside of your office. Another important issue is self-disclosure. We often make self-disclosures during therapy. However, excessive or inappropriate ones can erode the boundary and potentially harm the therapeutic relationship. So I'm going to throw out some optimal strategies for addressing these non-sexual multiple role relationships. First is the mindfulness issue. Keep in mind, especially if you hold more than one role, that your duties can sometimes collide. Give some thought about the way you would plan to handle that should it happen. Also consider circumstances where you may have multiple roles that could lead to compromising your objectivity, your judgment, or your ethical obligations. Strive to avoid them or step out of them when they occur. And these can happen in many contexts, ranging from therapy, mentoring, teaching, consulting. And having these multiple relationships are not necessarily unethical. You may become a mentor for someone you taught. You may be consulting with someone who later becomes a therapy patient. These are not necessarily unethical changes. They're just situations which demand some thoughtful consideration. And the level of obligation and commitment will obviously vary by context among those involved and can include personal, economic, social, or political factors. Case number 4. I'm calling this one, My Patient's Getting Married. You have worked with Lee in therapy for 2 years, and they've struggled to maintain a healthy love relationship. Well, it finally happened. Lee has invited you to the wedding because, as Lee tells you, you helped me get there. How are you going to handle the invitation to Lee's wedding? Go ahead and vote. Great, we've got some great responses coming in here. Overwhelming majority is going to say thank you, but decline. People are looking for various other ways to respond. At least none of you have offered to give Lee a congratulatory kiss in the receiving line. That's a plus. I can tell you as a pediatric psychologist, there have been times when I have attended a hockey game or a bar mitzvah or another ceremony in support of my patient. Although, like response B, if I do attend, I do my best to stay out of any social remarkable incidents. Although I did have one ironically amusing event where I attended a Shiva, a funerary reception following the death of someone I knew, only to bump into a former patient there who smiled, rushed up, gave me a hug, and announced to all those assembled there that he's my therapist. I smiled, paid my condolences, and left quickly. More issues to consider. Transference and countertransference. What is the patient going to project onto you? And countertransference, what feelings are you going to focus onto the patient? We recognize these. We try to recognize them. We try to be aware of them. And we try to be sure that they don't lead into biased or unethical behavior. We want to be careful about overstepping boundaries. Some therapists in the therapeutic role can become overly involved in their patients' lives and in making decisions on their behalf. This can be harmful to patients' autonomy and independence. And certainly we want to avoid exploitation cases, not just sexual, but in other circumstances where there might be some benefit or gain to the therapist that they haven't stepped away from. Self-disclosure is another interesting and important issue. And you think you're in control of what is disclosed about you to patients, but not always. Think about whether self-disclosure is intentional, unintentional, subtle, or obvious. For those of you that are not familiar with the rivalry between the Yankees and the Red Sox, do not show up at Fenway Park without covering up that Yankees tat. What does your office disclose about you, intentionally or inadvertently? Some of you have art in your offices. Some of you have books. Some of you have clutter. Some of you have diplomas. Some of you have a flag, American flag, gay pride flag, flags of other nations. Some of you will wear jewelry. You might wear a crucifix. You might have a Star of David. You might have some other jewelry that indicates something to a client. You may have photographs. You may have religious or spiritual symbols, interesting slip of the tongue, and your appearance or even your phenotype may say something to the patient. And intentionally or unintentionally, you are disclosing aspects of yourself. Some of this might be very intentional. You might, for example, have a gay pride flag sitting in a pedestal on your desk as a symbol to people that you're accepting and affirming. But again, you do not stop to think sometimes about what you're willing to share with people or what you may not be willing to share. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you some questions to think about that clients either have asked you or will definitely ask you about. There they are. And I believe you can check more than one. Are you married? Do you have kids? What's your religion? How old are you? What do you think of Obama, Trump, Biden, or any political issue you want to throw out? I suppose this week it could be Israel and Palestine. So go ahead and see. And as you can see, there are very common questions that at least a third of you have gotten answered about questions about your marital status or whether you have kids. And these are questions that may be of interest or may have some relevance to the patient. And do you know what you're disclosing when you choose to answer them? Do you have any understanding of what it is if you misdirect the patient or if you redirect the patient? Are we talking, we're here to talk about you, not me. Is that an empathic response? Does that shut down the patient or does that help you maintain your objectivity? Well, responses to these questions, is it curiosity? Is it meaningful or both? What is that? What does it mean referring to some object in your office? Are you married? Do you have kids? Are you a Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist? What do you think about news story or issue? Have you ever had to deal with blank? Where do you live? The where do you live question is particularly interesting. I'll give you a personal example of that later. Again, think through how you're going to answer these. And here are some thoughts about ways to conceptualize it. Some answers can serve a clinical purpose or move to achieve a desirable clinical outcome, such as forging an alliance, if you think or you know enough about the client to answer that question I threw out at you earlier. How will my answering this question be of use to the client? Some clinicians might worry that answering one question will lead to a slippery slope of other questions, more personal questions. And this indeed can happen, especially with some kinds of patients. And I think particularly of people with borderline personality disorders. If you see those people coming, you want very tight boundaries about informations that you dispense. But wait for a minute, things we're going to talk about in a minute, you're not in control of people getting all data about you. Other people might have a slightly different position and make a limited disclosure addressing the underlying concern. And even a few people will advertise that their psychotherapy is religiously informed or guided by specific orientations as a marketing effort because of the place where they work or population where they have some special expertise. The care issue here is limiting your self-disclosure because you don't want the conversation to be about you unrelated to the patient's needs. I want to tell you about an 8-year-old patient who once asked me where I lived. This was a child who had been physically abused by his parents. And about 2 or 3 months into therapy, he did say to me one day while we were playing a game of checkers, "Where do you live?" And I immediately did this mental calculus. I said, "Well, Michael, I'll tell you where I live, but why do you want to know?" And Michael said, "If my dad starts beating up my mom again, and if I get scared, maybe I could come to your house." That enabled me, that little bit of information, offering to share the information with him and eliciting back the meaning, helped me make a more appropriate intervention. I said to Michael, "Wow, thank you for telling me that. I want you to be safe and I want you to feel protected. The problem is I'm not home all the time. And do you know where the fire station is in your neighborhood? Where the police station is? You come to the hospital every week. How far is the hospital from where you live? Do you know how to get here?" Because those are safe places that are always open, the fire station, the police station, the hospital. And if you come to the hospital and go into the emergency room and ask them to find me, they can page me because they'll be able to find me even if I'm not home. And we can all do something to help keep you safe. So my intervention was designed to, I think I said to him, yes, I live in Brookline, but I'm not always home. So I partially answered his question, but I really answered the more substantive need that was being asked by the underlying question. So think about that if someone asks you those questions and frame your answers. Have your answers at the ready, because if you're an experienced therapist, you've already been asked these questions. If you're a novice therapist, you will be asked these questions. Best practices. So I recommend infrequent disclosures, and I recommend thinking carefully about how will my disclosure advance my work with this particular patient. Will it help to model something or normalize the therapeutic alliance or foster empathy? Does it focus on the needs of the patient? And then I'm going to watch how the patient responds to any self-disclosure. And I'm going to decide the self-disclosures based on the likely effect that I intend for the patients. Some patients respond well, others do not. So consider being limited and self-disclosure, especially when you have patients who are having trouble forming therapeutic relationships or certain diagnostic groups who may have trouble with reality testing or boundary problems themselves. And if disclosures appear to cause a problem, document this in your clinical record, both as a reminder to you later, and should problems come up later, you can document what happened and what you did about it to try to repair any breach that might have occurred. So again, my suggestion is respond and go to the root. I'll be glad to answer your question, but I'm curious about why you asked. I wonder if you asked about this because you want to know. When I was in my 20s, working in Boston Children's as a child therapist and unmarried or early married with no kids, I would often get asked if I had children. And people were wanting to know, can I understand their outlook, their values? Can you help me with my child's problem if you don't have kids of your own? And the answer was yes, I think so. Here's why. Knowing will work. How will knowing the answer to that question about me help us work together better? And then you can choose to answer it or not. There are some things you may not want to answer, but again, all depends on individual factors. I'd like to switch gears again into another non-sexual multiple relationship issue, very common, the whole idea of giving and receiving gifts and the potential boundary hazards involved in that. So I'm going to give you another case example, and I'm calling this one the unexpected gift. Carlos Santiago, a 40-year-old immigrant to the United States from Chile, had significant anxiety and moderate depression as he settled into his job with a wine importer in a small southern city. Mr. Santiago spoke English fluently and sought treatment from Dr. Worries, Dr. No More Worries. After 9 months of working together, Mr. Santiago's symptoms and concerns had resolved. His adjustment seemed quite solid, and Dr. Worries planned termination with him. At the end, they were having a final session. Mr. Santiago opens his briefcase and presents Dr. Worries with 2 gifts, a bottle of Chilean Burgundy and a book of Pablo Neruda's therapy. Another interesting flip, Pablo Neruda's poetry. Okay, you're Dr. Worries. What do you do? I'm glad no one's thinking they have to consult with the licensing board. And I'm also glad that none of you were trying to interpret this. But you can see the 2 biggest responses are to graciously decline the gift and to realize that the gift may have cultural meaning. Both of those are certainly appropriate. There are times that you may want to consider whether turning down a gift, especially a gift that does not have tremendous monetary value, but might have some cultural value or significance. Personally, my response would have been likely to have accepted Mr. Santiago's gift, because I'm wondering if in his culture, offering me these 2 gifts that are representative of Chilean culture might be meaningful to him, and whether I don't want to cause offense by turning them down. But I would say that either A or D, or perhaps some other response, might be certainly appropriate. Here's another one, case number 6, which I'm calling coffee time. During their second therapy session, patient Avery Bean noticed that therapist Dr. Latte was sipping a beverage with the logo of a coffee shop from the lobby of the office building. Avery and Dr. Latte had a brief exchange about their favorite caffeinated beverages. At the next session, Avery arrived carrying 2 beverages, 1 for each of them. Okay, Dr. Latte, what are you going to do? This case is actually one that was posed to me, a real situation. I was having a debate at an APA convention on a panel discussion with a colleague from Rutgers who was noted for having an office in his living room. And he posed this issue. He said he posed this question to one of his students, and the student said, well, if I was being supervised by you, I'd accept the beverage and say thank you. If I was being supervised by Moldavsky, referring to the late Stan Moldavsky, I would say no and interpret it. So again, a lot depends on your psychological orientation. A lot depends on the client's diagnosis. And a lot depends on what happens in future sessions. Does this become a habit? Is this happening at the future sessions? So again, think through what you're going to do with it. I would say any of these answers could be correct because, as I said to you at the beginning, context is everything. And context involves who you are as the therapist, what the issues are as the patient, who the patient is, what the patient's diagnosis is. So general considerations regarding gifts. Some therapists may not want to accept gifts at all. Others may leave room for unusual considerations. Again, I'm arguing case-by-case basis. Small tokens of appreciation that may have cultural significance or therapeutic significance certainly are not an ethical violation. Expensive gifts or those with inappropriate connotations should be politely declined. And in some cases, the offer of such gifts may warrant clinical discussion. Under no circumstances should we expect a gift, request a gift, or reward a gift. And again, I would document gifts in my case notes, along with my observations to myself about the influence that the gift has on the therapist-patient relationship. I would parse this. I'm sure most of you understand that you have a general clinical record, and you are also able to keep, if you wish, psychotherapy notes, which are intended for your own personal use, kept separately from the primary medical record. So you may choose to open a psychotherapy note file and make some observations for yourself that you would not put in the clinical record that the client might have likely access to, or that other people in the clinical setting might have access to. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about internet boundaries and what I'm referring to as the death of privacy, because certainly there are issues in self-disclosure of what we know about patients and what patients know about us that are very challenging to boundaries in this era of information superhighway. The ethics of using search engines to get information about patients is fairly complex and debatable. Psychology as a profession has not weighed in on this yet. I'll be interested to see if the proposed code of ethics that's coming down the pike makes any statement about whether or not it's appropriate to search for information about patients. But many professional organizations suggest that psychologists should rely primarily on what comes up in their office. A few considerations about Googling a patient. We do have a duty to maintain privacy and confidentiality. The question is whether looking for public information about a patient that they may post online without asking them for permission to do that is a breach of their privacy, or whether it might compromise trust if the patient found out about it. Open question. I'm sure there'll be different attitudes about it, because in a few minutes, I'm going to be telling you about surveys that say we all have different attitudes about this. How about informed consent? Yes, aside from the ethical standard of informed consent of privacy, we have an ethical standard on informed consent, and we're supposed to discuss the limitations of confidentiality and privacy with our patients. But if we think in the back of our minds that we might be wanting to search our patients on the internet, should we talk about this up front? Again, no clarity, no consensus that I've been able to determine. A few more considerations about the ethics of Googling your patient. Not everything you read on the internet is accurate. How about, again, bias and objectivity? Will conducting online searches about patients introduce extraneous variables that could change our objectivity or become an ethical problem itself? And again, accuracy or reliability. Can we rely on something that we might see online that could have a compromising effect on therapy? So the jurisdictions, the employers, and professions differ widely on what they have to say about this. Social work has a unique perspective. They revised their ethics code in 2021, and they specifically say in their privacy and confidentiality section that social workers develop and inform clients about their policies about technology and information gathering, and they avoid searching or gathering electronic information. It doesn't say, and this is interesting, it doesn't say thou shalt not do it. It says yes, that you avoid doing it. So what if it comes to light? What would the social work ethics committee or licensing board do? It depends, all contextual, right? Case number 7. I searched the internet about my new patient and discovered Sarah Smith has begun working with a new patient around issues of performance anxiety. The patient's bright, funny, articulate, likable. While talking with Sarah and in other one-to-one and small group situations, but sought treatment because he feels nervous when speaking to large groups, a requirement of his new job. After the 3rd session, Sarah looks him up on Google and discovers that his new job is a highly visible national leadership position with a white supremacist neo-Nazi organization. Sarah's great-grandparents died in Germany during the Holocaust. Okay, Dr. Smith, how are you going to handle this? These are interesting. These are interesting questions, and we're going to devolve into some more discussion, but I'll make a few comments about them as you're weighing in on this. One thing is the whole idea about whether it is ever ethical in therapy to introduce elements that aren't part of a treatment plan. And up to 3% of you seem to be saying that's possible. And there are many therapists who argue, especially in the current era of racial violence and religious bias and the social equity, social justice movement, that if we have clients who are spouting antisocial or things that are not part of our social justice portfolio that we adhere to ourselves, it's okay to try to deal with their racism or anger as an element of therapy. Here's a guy who didn't come into therapy looking to have any of that changed. And I think a large number of you talk about say nothing about the discovery and continue treatment, but Sarah's going to have some feelings about this. A third of you is saying that Sarah might have feelings that might get in the way, and so she ought to find an excuse without confronting the patient to refer the patient out. Still, a good percentage of you think it's okay to confront the patient with the discovery and to cite that as a basis in terminating treatment. And indeed, there are elements of our ethics code that say that you do not have to treat people who threaten you. And it doesn't have to be a physical threat. It could be a threat of legal action. It could be making you feel unsafe. You are not required to treat people in that circumstance. And there's almost a third of you that have yet other things that you would think about doing. But the thing that I love about your responses to this question is, again, it illustrates context and it illustrates the diversity of opinion into how we might handle situations like this in the complexity of what we might discover online doing searches. So when therapists look for patients, I'm going to give you a quick summary of 9 patient-targeted Googling PTG studies. Cox and colleagues did a meta-analysis, and the jargon that you'll see in the literature is PTG, referring to patient-targeted Googling, and then there's TTG, when the therapist is the target of the Googling by the patient. A lot of variation. Psychologists self-reporting or psychotherapists self-reporting ranged from 20 to 98% saying that they had Googled clients. Most commonly, the motivation was they're suspicious that the patient is lying about something, or that they're trying to verify details shared in therapy, or they're obtaining new information. So a lot of people admit to curiosity. And then there's the hazard. These can make the therapist aware of information that might raise a cause for concern or stir up countertransference issues, just as we saw with the last case. Wu and Sone, 2 psychologists, published this survey in Professional Psychology on 4 types of therapy boundary crossings in the digital age. They talked about online advertising. And I'm putting this up here as a mode of self-disclosure. Now, people, I chuckle at this inwardly because when I was first becoming licensed as a psychologist, advertising was verboten. You might publish a discrete ad in the newspaper that you were opening a practice. But today, for people to find you, you have to have a presence. You have to have either a public presence or a website or a media presence or a listing in some directory, at least to start a practice. Word of mouth might take over and be helpful for you after a while, but you have got to have an online presence in some way or be out there in directories for people to find you. And this involves a degree of self-disclosure, presentation of yourself, thinking about your boundaries. Using social media platforms, YouTube, Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, to provide online psychoeducation. Some people offer psychological education via public media. And again, this can be a way to attract attention and clients. They noted that a large number of our colleagues accept social media requests. Are you going to agree to be a friend on Facebook? Or are you going to accept a link in from a client? And then again, there's a range of social media. Facebook is quite different from LinkedIn. And how do you manage those connections? And how do you deal with friend requests? Searching for information about a client online via search engines. And so here, boundary crossings in the digital age. Regarding those non-sexual multiple role relationships, are you going to accept a friend request from a client or a request to join the digital social network? The vast majority of participants said unquestionably they weren't going to do that. They thought it was unethical. There were other people who talked about it being ethical under rare circumstances, and 8% expressed uncertainty. I personally choose not to friend people on social networks. I do have a Facebook page, but you're likely to never find it because it's under an alias and hard to identify, but because people need Facebook for various purposes, I decided to do that. I do have a LinkedIn page where I display professional information about myself and occasionally post professional bulletins. I have occasionally accessed patients' social media sites at their request. This has been particularly when working with some adolescent patients who have chronic illnesses and who socialize with peers through their social network and have told me about something on their social network that they would like me to see. I will look at it. However, I don't reciprocate by having friend relationships. If you do choose to engage to share things on social networks, you do want to be mindful about privacy settings and what people will be able to see if they look at your site, if you give them access to it. If you don't understand those privacy settings, be sure that you do before you give anyone access. Therapist ethicality ratings of patient-targeted Googling was also negative. About a third of the therapists said that patient-targeting Googling, looking up your patients, is unquestionably unethical. And about half deemed these crossings ethical under rare circumstances. And remember, this is looking for public information. Interestingly, 10% expressed uncertainty. So again, this is an area that remains to be dealt with, and it will be quite interesting to see what APA's new code of conduct recommends in this regard. Now, even though the APA code allows us to do ads and post information about our practices that are not false or misleading, we do want to be careful about the material that we post. Only 20% of respondents to these surveys, the Wu and Sony studies, said that advertising online was unquestionably ethical. And 60% said ethical under many circumstances. I would say it depends. In general, I would see advertising as ethical as long as it's not false or misleading. A majority of participants rated providing psychoeducation via social media as unquestionably ethical or ethical under many circumstances. In fact, it can be a good strategy for finding patients if you have a way to put out YouTube videos or brief TikTok hints to people that are helpful in dealing with life problems. They may, by virtue of seeing you, hearing you, and imagining what you might be like in therapy based on that presentation, they might find you the type of therapist they would like to see, or not. A notable percentage was uncertain about the ethicality, and a higher percentage reported that they didn't know or were unsure. So again, this is a whole area that is in flux, but I can only imagine that people are increasingly going to be moving to have some professional online presence as a way of helping clients define them. How about online advertising and non-sexual multiple role relationships? The therapist participants reported highest frequency advertising online, with only 29% saying they never did it. The majority indicated that they never provided psychosocial information, and digital multiple role relationships. That is 95% did not engage in multiple role relationships. 95% are not friending in their social media. A smaller percentage indicated that they had never Googled the patient. Therapist gender was interestingly a significant predictor with Googling, patient-targeted Googling. Males were less likely to endorse patient-targeted Googling than females. although another way to say this is males were less likely to acknowledge doing it than females. Who knows where the truth lies in that? So do realize that your patients will check you out online. In Cox's studies, they discovered that they looked at both patient-targeted and therapist-targeted Googling. 2/3 of patients will Google their therapist, at least 2/3. And those who are having therapy privately or had worked with more than one therapist or were having sessions more often, the more intense the relationship or the more experienced they were as patients, the more likely they were to target you as a therapist to find out about you in Googling. This profile was particularly common among patients in psychodynamic therapy. Who's going to interpret that for me? More survey data on who searches who. Patients' motivations were wanting to see if the therapist is qualified, curious about their therapist. They stopped therapy, but they missed their therapist and wanted to see what the therapist was doing, or they wanted to try to know their therapist better. Nearly 1/4 of the people who did the therapist-targeted Googling thought the findings impacted the relationship, but only 1 out of 5 told the therapist that they'd done that. It's interesting. What they're finding out about us online is influencing how they feel about the relationship, but they won't necessarily tell us about it. So think about managing your online presence. If you don't have one, set up a personal website and use internet search optimization. Why would you want to do this? Because you control the content and the message. You can choose what to put up there. You can control the message. And if you optimize it, it may be the first thing that pops up on a Google search under your name. Most people don't search terribly deep into Google, so at least you have a way of framing your presence online quickly. If you work for an agency or an employer, they're going to want to put your name up. They're probably going to want to put your picture up because your picture may suggest gender or racial identity, which may be important to a client who wants to see someone of the same race or the same gender and not be able to tell simply that by name. And so this might be an affiliation. Information about you might answer questions about your level of experience or your credentials. If you use social media and deploy privacy controls, be careful to differentiate between professional sites like a LinkedIn site, which is primarily professional to professional, and purely social sites like Facebook. And again, consider using an alias that makes you hard to find on non-professional sites, especially if you want to be sharing information among friends, which you would not want your patients to see, such as your performance on the beach during your last vacation. Understand that you have no control over access to any public records or stories by the press. You just don't control that, and you don't have any access to limiting that, but understand that that's going to be out there. And take precautions against hacking. For those of you that haven't seen Mr. Robot, the TV series, it's an interesting study about how a very intelligent autistic patient hacked his psychotherapist's email and social media and made use of that for various purposes. Case number 8, the angry review. After 4 sessions of therapy, River Rage quit after you set limits on the frequent emergency phone calls and intrusive questions. River returned for another 2 sessions and then quit again. They've ignored your bill for their insurance copayment. You recognize this pattern as an aspect of borderline personality disorder, and you're annoyed but not surprised when a colleague tells you about a posting River made about you on a public community website. The posting describes you as an incompetent, uncaring, and abusive therapist who's never helped me, grossly overcharged me, and does not truly care about their patients. So what you going to do? Well, the largest group of people are going to ignore it. And, you know, when any of us are looking at reviews, we do realize that in any cluster of lots of reviews, there are going to be occasional negatives. And we're probably going to want to look at a lot of reviews before making a decision. Very few people are going to contact River. Very few people are going to contact a lawyer to seek defamation remedies. Probably not helpful. A small number are going to think about a rebuttal. Most of you are going to think of some other alternative, about 20% of you. So dealing with negative reviews is the practice. In general, I would discriminate between a 1-star rating versus defamation. A 1-star rating, you know, they just say, oh, it wasn't very good. If someone starts to say, well, Kuchar isn't a very good therapist, that's one thing. If they say, not only is Kuchar not a very good therapist, he's a child molester. You're getting into the range of defamation, false and defamatory remarks, as opposed to opinions. And you may want to treat the defamation ones much more seriously. Respond or ignore. I go along with most people who are suggesting ignoring therapy, but if you must respond, think of something like this. Simply posting in response. As an ethical psychologist, I owe all current and past patients a duty of confidentiality. I cannot disclose whether any person is or ever was my patient or respond to public comments about cases. Interesting. So this is I can neither confirm or deny whether they were even ever my patient. The value of a posting like this, if you must post it, tells the intelligent reader, this person is upholding ethical responsibilities, and there are two sides to every story, but this person is barred from even presenting their side. But again, posting something like this might trigger your borderline patient or your patient whose reality testing has gone astray to repost, to make the issue messier and messier. So you may want to consider doing nothing. Google yourself routinely to monitor potential issues. You can sign up for Google Alerts that will notify you if you get mentioned, and use different names, you know, depending on how you are represented, because people may use a nickname or initials or other ways to cite you. Understand why people act out online. Any of us who have been on listservs for any period of time have seen hostile comments. There are some issues related to race, gender, religious conflicts, which tend to pull out the worst in people, angry responses. There are a couple of different factors that contribute to what's been termed the online disinhibition effect that people illustrate. When they're engaged in online or asynchronous communication, people sometimes feel safer saying things they wouldn't say in real life. Sometimes they're responding late in the evening. Sometimes they're responding while under the influence of substances. Plus, there are empathy deficits, individual personality, and cultural factors that can all contribute. And there's no affect, there's no eye contact, there's no body language, which can moderate the simple text that can be more distressing than a message delivered with empathy. So apply restraint in your online communications. Again, sometimes people, because they have anonymity in giving reviews, can throw things out. However, people, and I've seen this oftentimes on psychologist listservs, people will get out of control and say offensive things because something strikes an emotional chord, and for whatever reason, in the moment, they need to respond and are disinhibited. Another important thing is responding to messages when you're out of the office, when you're late at night, when you're under stress, or when you're not in a professional frame of reference is not a good idea. Resist that temptation. If it's a meaningful thing to respond to, you can do it tomorrow. Do I have to treat nasty people? And can I try to fix them, even if they're not asking me to fix them? And this gets back to the issue of boundaries and agreeing to treat people and setting up treatment goals. And as we have here, the reason to remove the restraints will become obvious once we get into therapy. So here's case number 9, angry or hateful patients. An attorney has referred Bob Luster for some help with depression and anger management. Bob is facing a court date for shoving an elderly man to the ground during a recent political rally. During intake, you find that Bob is a loving spouse, a caring parent, but he struggles with chronic depression and anger focused on the ills of society. You also learn he's an active member of the Bully Boys Battalion, a group known for taking fascist political stances. His values seem polar opposites of your own social and political values. What you going to do? Again, I agree with the people who are saying on point A that you don't have an obligation to accept him, to treat him. And for those people who feel this way, you're saying to him, my countertransference in treating with him would be so significant that it would be easier for him to forge an alliance with a therapist who doesn't feel that way. So I'm going to refer him out. And in referring him out, I personally would probably try to do so without denigrating him based on his political beliefs and affiliations. I'd probably try to say to him, you know, as you describe your issues, I have some other therapists who I think might be better fits for you. Although you may want to think to yourself, do you want to send this angry Bully Boys patient to one of your friends? Or how do you want to handle that? But you don't have an obligation to treat him. If you do decide to treat him, if you say, well, I can manage the countertransference, I'm going to focus on the depression and anger. I'm not going to talk politics with him. I'm going to try to focus on those symptoms that he's brought to me as the presenting symptoms. Others of you think, well, okay, along the way, I can work with the depression and anger, but maybe I can help him to be more tolerant in general by working on his depression and anger. Maybe I can help him be a little bit more pro-social. None of you are telling him he has to quit the Bully Boys. Smart move, probably wouldn't work. And some of you have some creative other ideas, which I haven't allowed you to express in my forced choice poll. But again, a range of responses. And I can't take issue with any of those responses. Again, context, knowing yourself as a therapist, understanding the patient, critical values in these non-sexual multiple role and boundary questions. Should social justice concerns ever enter the therapy space? we are going to encounter people who have societal focused anger, people who make prejudice comments, people who talk about racial and ethnic offensive things in therapy. Some of us would prefer to discharge or refuse treatment of such patients. Others of us argue that social justice obligations say not only should we treat them, but we should adjust those prejudices in the process. Other people say no, focus on the therapy and ignore these distractions. And other people say we've got to think this through. And I would definitely encourage you to read this wonderful paper by Mrbro, Najab, Sam Knapp, and Mike Gottlieb, which was published in Professional Psychology in 2020. It's a wonderful roadmap for talking through these problems with lots of examples and very thoughtful approaches. We need not, however, tolerate offensive or hate speech during sessions. Someone who's swearing, who's using derogatory terms or similar hate speech, whether it's directed at the community or to the clinician themselves in the office or to our office staff, we do not need to tolerate that. And you'll want to calibrate your response based on whether it warrants a warning to please discontinue this kind of talk versus whether it warrants considering termination and referral. When patients act in this manner, the key issue is to respond in a professional tone as quickly as possible with corrective limits being set. And of course, the nature of the intervention might vary. It's one thing if you're dealing with a patient who has Tourette's syndrome or an active psychotic process. It's another thing if you're dealing with a person who may be character disordered or have some other type of a personality disorder where they should have the ability to exert more self-control. I also talked about supervisors needing to intervene in support of trainees. One of the very powerful experiences that I had as a therapist back in the early 1980s, when Boston was under a lot of pressure because of racial desegregation, I had a Black male trainee who had a youngster he was assessing and treating for enuresis, secondary enuresis, age 6 or 7, used the N-word in therapy, knocking off little toy soldiers with his fingers saying, kill the N-word, kill the N-word, kill the N-word. And this young man came in to the supervisor and is describing the situation. And here I am, the white guy, hearing the Black man talk about how he was offended in therapy, presenting it to me in an affectless manner. And I'm having to say to him, hey, Paul, you do not have to put up with that. And I had to draw out and support the concerns of my trainee, even though they were concerns that would be alien to my professional and personal experience. I recognize them as an unacceptable thing. I'm supporting the trainee and I'm helping the trainee to figure out how we move forward. In this particular case, the predictable issue was that this kid was hearing this language at home, that the therapist was going to hear it again in another session, and the therapist should use it, call a timeout and say, that's not a word that we use in therapy. That's not an appropriate word to use. So I'd like you to stop using that word. And again, we would elevate it to talk with the kid's family about it if it recurred. And again, it did not recur after the therapist's intervention, and he was able to be effective. But again, you as the therapist have to be prepared that some of your supervisees, or as a supervisor, not a therapist, be aware that some of your supervisees may be subjected to this type of thing, and you will have to guide them and coach them in dealing with offensive behavior in the therapy session. So again, ethically, Can I refuse to accept or fire a patient? Yes, you do have a license to do that. Boundary reasons, related reasons for terminating under the APA Code of Conduct. Well, one boundary reason is, I don't know how to do this. This patient needs someone with a level of experience or skills that I do not possess. I'm recognizing the boundaries of my competence, so I'm going to refer them to someone where they can get more effective services. My issues will get in the way. Look, I've got enough problems with this particular issue in my own life. I recognize what your issue is going to be. I'm not disclosing to you what my personal issues are, but I'm going to refer you because I know that this issue that you're struggling with is too hot for me to handle countertransferentially. Then there are multiple relationships. And interestingly, multiple relationships can arise after treatment begins. A relationship that you did not know you have comes up. The classic would involve people who are working in a college counseling center, where you're doing an intake on a student who's having terrible problems with their roommate, the roommate from hell, and you're working with them to manage their feelings about this. And then another referral comes in, and about halfway through the intake, you realize that that's the roommate coming in and saying the same thing about their other roommate. Obvious conflict. Fortunately, you're in the beginning stages with one. You can refer that one out, assuming there's more than one staff member at this college counseling center. But sometimes these relationships will come up in ways that you would have to terminate. One of my favorites, true story, was a patient who had had an unfortunate surgical result. And as a result of that surgical unfortunate result, was in therapy dealing with, among other things, what they felt was the sad outcome of their surgical result. Well, it turns out that they're going to sue their therapist. Sue the surgeon. They tell their therapist that they're going to sue the surgeon, and will the therapist write a letter about the emotional distress they've been under, at which point the therapist realizes that the surgeon who's being sued is their spouse, who has a different surname. So there's the patient in therapy telling the spouse of the person they want to sue, they're going to sue their spouse, which could have financial ramifications for the therapist, and asking the therapist to have an alliance with them to engage in that lawsuit. And again, that's a situation where the therapist really needs to call a timeout, get some consultation, and disentangle themselves. Again, an example of a horrible multiple role relationship, totally unplanned, totally unexpected, that pops up in the middle of a therapy relationship. Conflict of interest. Also, similar cases, conflict of interest can arise after treatment begins. And then finally, the worst circumstances is, of course, if the client is not benefiting from our services or is being harmed by services, then we can continue, or we have a responsibility to terminate and refer. But also, if we are threatened or feel threatened or endangered by the patient or another person with whom the patient has a relationship, we have the right to terminate that relationship. A little bit about personal space and non-erotic touch. I have another case for you. Stand By You sought treatment from psychologist Eileen Away 6 months ago with complaints of social anxiety, loneliness, and depression following a series of unhealthy relationships. Mr. Bayou has had a stoic disposition and rarely shows emotion. In a recent session, following the death of his mother, Mr. Bayou described feeling emotionally abused and unloved by her. He begins to sob. His whole body is shaking toward the end of the session. In response, Dr. Away offered him a hug, told him that he was loved, and gently escorted him to the door. The following week, during their scheduled session, Mr. Bayou seems happier than ever. He expressed overwhelming gratitude to Dr. Away and reported finally feeling positive about the future. As the session ended, Mr. Bayou asked for a hug and attempted to kiss Dr. Away. Upon seeing her uncomfortable reaction, Mr. Bayou became agitated, called Dr. Away a tease, and walked out of the office. Dr. Away attempted to reach Mr. Bayou, got no response. What do you think about Dr. Away's response in this situation? I love the range of the responses that we're getting here. And again, context is everything. And a good number of you are admitting to feeling unsure about how to respond. And here we have, I'm willing to say in my own mind, Dr. Away made an impulsive, affective, supportive response in the moment. And it was misinterpreted. I don't think she was intentionally unethical. I don't think this is a slippery slope, but I think it's a sad situation. And there are other ways to handle it. And especially given the client's prior reticence and the emotional outburst, she might have thought differently about it. But my suspicion is that Dr. Away, he or she, I guess I made her a she in this particular case, was trying to be an empathic responder. Oh, so I'm sorry. So here's your next step. What should she do next? What should Dr. Away do next? I'm with the 90+%. We're going with D. All of the above. Reaching out to Mr. Bayou, seeking to remedy the therapeutic rupture, but also debriefing with a colleague or a therapist of her own to think through some of what went wrong and how she might handle the reparative session, but certainly to document in the case file. And I'm glad none of you are planning to move out of town quickly. So consider the use of non-sexual touch in psychotherapy for greeting clients, consoling clients in grief or despair, grounding clients in the present moment, restraining a violent or assaultive client, expressing understanding, providing encouragement, showing empathy and reliability, communicating safety, comfort, and trust, enhancing the relationship. All of those are very appropriate reasons in the moment for non-therapeutic touch. In the non-COVID era, I would certainly offer clients a handshake on greeting them. COVID era, we were doing elbows. Certainly, I've worked with families in moments of terminal illness and thinking about different kinds of things. All of these are important. And I'm going to go back to the key point that I mentioned very early. Think in the moment as you think about what non-sexual touch you might engage in. How will doing whatever make a positive difference for the client? Touch may be inappropriate when the clinician has too limited a history to know what's going on, when the patient has sexualized ideation, if they are a victim of assault, neglect, attachment difficulties, or any kind of sexual intimacy issues. Steps you can take: assess your personal boundaries, communicate limits clearly, respond to boundary crossings in real time, and don't join Doctors Without Boundaries. I pushed ahead a little bit quickly to give time for questions, Jana.
Yes, thank you. And certainly thank you very much for a very wonderful presentation. Very complex issues, and the interactivity was great. We have a few questions, and so let me see how many we can get in. So this is related to your talking about how you might follow up with someone in a particular circumstance that's a patient. What about funerals when you treated a caregiver of a dementia patient? Person's asking, how do you deal with that? Do you go? Do you not? What do you do when you get there?
I've been on the other end of that, having spent a lot of time working with families around terminal illness. What I would say is, first think about it. If you're going to a funeral, the two reasons to go. One is to show support for someone who's alive, or to comfort someone who's alive. And that may be the surviving family members of a person you cared for, or a person who you cared for while they were dealing with the death of someone else, knowing that that death might trigger other feelings with them. And then second, yourself, as a self-care issue. If you've been working with a patient and the patient has passed on, going to that funeral may give you a sense of closure and completeness. But again, the key is asking yourself, how will this help someone, whether it's the surviving family members or the patient who has had the loss? And again, restricting your behavior in public to offering support. And then if people need to follow up with more sensitive issues, doing that in a follow-up session.
Great, thank you. And now to the gift giving. Question is, how do you determine the level of an expensive gift? Is it an absolute number, or does that also depend on the context of the patient's finances?
So I'm smiling from ear to ear, because one of the cases that I encountered when serving on the APA Ethics Committee in the 1970s was a therapist who had a very wealthy patient give them a Mercedes.
Oh my.
As a gift, and then later get angry and want the Mercedes back, and filed an ethics complaint.
Wow.
So again, the question is not so much considering the capacity of the giver of the gift as thinking of what the gesture means.
Yes.
And so I wish I could give you a specific answer, but it's contextual again.
Yes, I agree. I think all of us have received gifts to some extent that we've wondered. I remember I had a patient who brought me a roasted chicken, but it had great meaning for her. And so I think it's not one size fits all. You may accept gifts from one patient under certain circumstances and not from another. So
as a child therapist, I was once treating a child who was a fecal smearer who brought me some cookies that he had baked with his mother.
Oh, wow.
And I accepted the cookies and they went in the wastebasket.
Yeah. Yes. And here's another different type of gift, so to speak. I'm a founder of a nonprofit organization. A patient somehow found out about it and made a generous donation without informing me of it beforehand. This was done during the course of therapy. How would you have handled this?
Well, when I eventually found out about it, I would probably have sent a brief thank you note to the patient for their generosity with respect to the charity that was important to me. If the patient were telling me about it or were making it obvious in some way, it might be a basis for discussion and interpretation. But the fact that a patient has done something very nice for something I care about, that I have not personally benefited from, I don't see that as a boundary violation.
Great, thank you. Now, how best to respond to a patient's questions regarding a therapist's health when the therapist's health issue is notable? For example, chemo effects such as hair loss.
Again, one has to give careful thought to that in advance. And so if you're going to be a cancer patient and you know you're going to have hair loss and you know that you're going to be continuing treatment, this goes back to my comment about what your phenotype tells the patient.
Mm-hmm.
Another much more common example for female therapists is dealing with pregnancy with your patients and how you're going to handle it. And you have to think through what you're comfortable with what your response is that you're comfortable with. And again, if patients ask you how you're doing and you want to be less disclosing, which would be my preferred option personally, I would say, well, thank you very much for asking. I'm doing fine, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, I want the therapy to be about them.
Right.
If it kept coming up, I'd be concerned about, I would make a comment about how touching it is that they are concerned about me, but I really do want to focus on doing all I can to be helpful to them and try to send it back.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more. I'd love to hear if Dr. Kuchar would share how he deals with what he says with direct questions about political issues or when patients bring up political issues that I don't agree with.
I would say, wow, that's a hot topic that everyone is buzzing about. And I appreciate that you're interested in my opinion, but I don't want my opinion to bias you in any way. So I'm going to respectfully keep my opinions to myself.
Yeah, great.
Because again, I don't know. Do they want to have an intellectual discussion about it? Okay, but therapy isn't the place to do that. And am I going to say something that is going to alienate them or cause any gains we've made to go into the toilet because they now disrespect me?
Yes, very, very good response. I think overall, you're really talking about don't feel as if you have to respond immediately. Reflection is good. There are times, especially when I was working with children, where I would say, you know, that's a really good question. I'm going to need some time to think about that. But while I'm thinking about it, what are your thoughts if I were to ask you that question?
Yeah, how do you feel when you express your views and someone disagrees with you out in the world?
Right.
How does that affect you?